We have had some dramatic entrances and exits upon our small stage at Baker Street, but I cannot recollect anything more sudden and startling than the first appearance of Thornycroft Huxtable, N.A., Ph.D., etc. His card, which seemed too small to carry the weight of his academic distinctions, preceded him by a few seconds, and then he entered himself, so large, so pompous, and so dignified that he was the very embodiment of self, possession and solidity, and yet his first action, when the door had closed behind him, was to stagger against the table, whence he slipped down upon the floor, and there was that majestic figure prostrate and insensible upon our bearskin hearth rug. We had sprung to our feet, and for a few moments we stared in silent amazement at this ponderous piece of wreckage, which told of some sudden and fatal storm far out on the ocean of life. Then Holmes hurried with a cushion for his head, and I with brandy for his lips. The heavy, white face was seamed with lines of trouble, the hanging pouches under the closed eyes were leaden in color. The loose mouth drooped dolorously at the corners, the rolling chins were unshaven. Collar and shirt bore the grime of a long journey, and the hair bristled unkempt from the well-shaped head.
"What is it, Watson?"
"Ask."
"Absolute exhaustion, possibly mere hunger and fatigue,"
said I with my finger on the thready pulse.
"Return ticket from Mackleton, in the north of England,"
said Holmes, drawing it from the watch pocket.
"It is not 12 o'clock yet? He has certainly been an early starter."
The puckered eyelids had begun to quiver, and now a pair of vacant gray eyes looked up at us. An instant later the man had scrambled onto his feet, his face crimson with shame.
"Forgive this weakness, Mr. Holmes. I have been a little overwrought. Thank you. If I might have a glass of milk and a biscuit, I have no doubt that I should be better. I came personally, Mr. Holmes, in order to ensure that you would return with me. I feared that no telegram would convince you of the absolute urgency of the case. I wish you, Mr. Holmes, to come to Mackleton with me by the next train."
My friend shook his head.
"My colleague, Dr. Watson, could tell you that we are very busy at present. I am retained in this case of the Ferrers documents, and the Abergavenny murder is coming up for trial. Only a very important issue could call me from London at present."
"Important."
Our visitor threw up his hand.
"Have you heard nothing of the abduction of the only son of the Duke of Holderness?"
"What, the late cabinet minister?"
"Exactly. We had tried to keep it out of the papers, but there was some rumor in the Globe last night."
Holmes shot out his long, thin arm and picked out volume H in his encyclot dire of reference.
"Holderness, 6th Duke, KGPC, half the alphabet, Lord Lieutenant of Hallamshire since 1900. Married Edith, daughter of Sir Charles Appledore, 1888. Heir and only child, Lord Saltire. Owns about 250,000 acres. Minerals in Lancashire and Wales. Address Carlton House Terrace, Holderness Hall, Hallamshire. Well, this man is certainly one of the greatest subjects of the Crown."
"The greatest and perhaps the wealthiest. I may tell you, however, that His Grace has already intimated that a check for £5,000 will be handed over to the person who can tell him where his son is."
"It is a princely offer. Watson, I think that we shall accompany Dr. Huxtable back to the north of England. And now, Dr. Huxtable, when you have consumed that milk—"
"I must inform you, gentlemen, that the Priory is a preparatory school, of which I am the founder and principal. The Priory is, without exception, the best and most select preparatory school in England. But I felt that my school had reached its zenith when, weeks ago, the Duke of Holderness sent Mr. James Wilder, his secretary, with intimation that young Lord Saltire, 10 years old, his only son and heir, was about to be committed to my charge. On May 1st the boy arrived. He was a charming youth and he soon fell into our ways. But he was not entirely happy at home. It is an open secret that the Duke's married life had not been a peaceful one, and the matter had ended in a separation by mutual consent, the Duchess taking up her residence in the south of France. The boy's sympathies are known to have been strongly with his mother. He moped after her departure from Holderness Hall, and it was for this reason that the Duke desired to send him to my establishment. He was last seen on the night of May 13th. His room was on the second floor and was approached through another larger room in which 2 boys were sleeping. These boys saw and heard nothing. His window was open, and there is a stout ivy plant leading to the ground. We could trace no footmarks below, but it is sure that this is the only possible exit. His absence was discovered at 7 o'clock on Tuesday morning. His bed had been slept in. He had dressed himself fully, before going off in his usual school suit of black Eton jacket and dark grey trousers. Heidegger, the German master, was missing. His room was on the second floor, at the farther end of the building. His bed had also been slept in, but he had apparently gone away partly dressed. He had undoubtedly let himself down by the ivy, for we could see the marks of his feet where he had landed on the lawn. His bicycle was kept in a small shed beside this lawn, and it also was gone.
"You have been very remiss in not coming to me sooner,"
said he severely.
"You start me on my investigation with a very serious handicap. It is inconceivable, for example, that this ivy and this lawn would have yielded nothing to an expert observer, so that 3 days have been wasted. The affair has been most deplorably handled. Well, now, you do not mean to seriously suggest that this German rode off upon a bicycle in the dead of the night, bearing the boy in his arms?
Certainly not. The bicycle may have been a blind. It may have been hidden somewhere, and the pair gone off on foot.
Did anyone call to see the boy on the day before he disappeared?
No.
Did he get any letters?
Yes, one letter, from his father.
How do you know it was from the father?
The coat of arms was on the envelope, and it was addressed in the Duke's peculiar stiff hand.
If he has had no visitors, that prompting must have come in letters. Were the relations between father and son very friendly?
His Grace is never very friendly with anyone. He is completely immersed in large public questions, but he was always kind to the boy in his own way.
I will order a four-wheeler. In a quarter of an hour we shall be at your service. If you are telegraphing home, Mr. Huxtable, it would be well to allow the people in your neighborhood to imagine that the inquiry is still going on in Liverpool.
That evening found us in the cold, bracing atmosphere of the Peak Country. It was already dark when we reached it. A card was lying on the hall table, and the butler whispered something to his master.
"The Duke is here,"
said he.
"The Duke and Mr. Wilder are in the study. Come, gentlemen, and I will introduce you."
He was a tall and stately person, scrupulously dressed, with a drawn, thin face and a nose which was grotesquely curved and long. His complexion was of a dead pallor. A long, dwindling beard of vivid red flowed down over his white waistcoat. Beside him stood a very young man, small, nervous, alert, with intelligent light blue eyes.
"I called this morning, Dr. Huxtable, too late to prevent you from starting for London. His Grace is surprised that you should have taken such a step without consulting him.
When I learned that the police had failed.
His Grace is by no means convinced that the police have failed."
"But surely, Mr. Wilder."
"Hardly that, doctor, hardly that,"
said Holmes in his blandest voice.
"This northern air is invigorating and pleasant, so I propose to spend a few days upon your moors."
"I agree with Mr. Wilder, that you would have done wisely to consult me. But since Mr. Holmes has already been taken into your confidence, it would indeed be absurd that we should not avail ourselves of his services."
"I would only ask you now, sir, whether you have formed any explanation in your own mind as to the mysterious disappearance of your son."
"No, sir, I have not."
"Do you think that the Duchess had anything to do with the matter?"
The great minister showed perceptible hesitation.
"I do not think so,"
he said at last.
"Did you post that letter yourself?"
"His Grace is not in the habit of posting letters himself,"
said he.
"This letter was laid with others upon the study table, and I myself put them in the post bag."
The boy's chamber was carefully examined, and yielded nothing save the absolute conviction that it was only through the window that he could have escaped. The German master's room gave no further clue. In his case a trailer of ivy had given way under his weight, and we saw by the light of a lantern the mark on the lawn where his heels had come down. Holmes left the house alone, and only returned after 11. He had obtained a large ordnance map of the neighborhood, and this he brought into my room. Having balanced the lamp in the middle of it, he began to smoke over it, and occasionally to point out objects of interest with the reeking amber of his pipe.
"Look at this map. This dark square is the Priory School. This line is the main road. At this point, a county constable was on duty from 12 to 6. This man declares that he was not absent from his post for an instant. That blocks this end. We have now to deal with the other. There is an inn here, the Red Bull. Here there lies a grove of trees, marked as the Ragged Shaw, and on the farther side stretches a great rolling moor, Lower Gill Moor. Surely it is here to the north that our quest must lie."
There was an agitated knock at the door, and an instant afterwards Dr. Huxtable was in the room. In his hand he held a blue cricket cap with a white chevron on the peak.
"At last we have a clue. It is his cap. Found in the van of the gypsies who camped on the moor. They shuffled and lied, said that they found it on the moor on Tuesday morning."
It at least bears out the theory that it is on the side of the Lower Gill Moor that we must hope for results. I will call you early to morrow morning, Watson.
The day was just breaking when I woke to find the long, thin form of Holmes by my bedside. He was fully dressed.
"I have done the lawn and the bicycle shed. Now, Watson, there is cocoa ready in the next room."
With high hopes we struck across the peaty russet moor, but no sign of him or the German could be seen. With a darkening face my friend strode along the margin, eagerly observant of every muddy stain.
"Hello, hello! What have we here?"
We had come on a small black ribbon of pathway. In the middle of it, clearly marked on the sodden soil, was the track of a bicycle.
A bicycle, certainly, but not the bicycle. This is a Dunlop, with a patch upon the outer cover. Heidegger's tires were Palmer's. Therefore, it is not Heidegger's track. This track was made by a rider who was going from the direction of the school.
Or towards it.
No. The more deeply sunk impression is, of course, the hind wheel. It was undoubtedly heading away from the school.
Following the path backwards, we picked out another spot. Here once again was the mark of the bicycle, though nearly obliterated by the hoofs of cows.
It is, of course, possible that a cunning man might change the tires of his bicycle in order to leave unfamiliar tracks. We will leave this question undecided and hark back to our morass again.
Soon our perseverance was gloriously rewarded. An impression like a fine bundle of telegraph wires ran down the center of it. It was the Palmer tires.
Here is Herr Heidegger, sure enough. Do you observe that the rider is now undoubtedly forcing the pace? Look at this impression where you get both tires clear. The rider is throwing his weight onto the handle bar, as a man does when he is sprinting.
Holmes held up a crumpled branch of flowering gorse. To my horror I perceived that the yellow blossoms were all dabbled with crimson. On the path, too, were dark stains of clotted blood. Out of the gorse bushes we dragged a bicycle Palmer tired. On the other side lay the unfortunate rider. He was a tall man, full-bearded, with spectacles. The cause of his death was a frightful blow upon the head, which had crushed in part of his skull. Holmes turned the body over reverently, and examined it with great attention.
There is a fellow cutting peat up yonder. Bring him over here, and he will guide the police.
I brought the peasant across, and Holmes dispatched the frightened man with a note to Dr. Huxtable.
We have picked up 2 clues this morning. One is the bicycle with the Palmer tire, and we see what that has led to. The other is the bicycle with the patched Dunlop. Why did he go? Because, from his bedroom window, he saw the flight of the boy. He seized his bicycle, pursued the lad, and in pursuing him met his death. He meets his death 5 miles from the school, not by a bullet, but by a savage blow. The lad, then, had a companion in his flight, and the flight was a swift one. Let us see what the Dunlop with the patched cover has to offer us.
We picked up the track and followed it onward for some distance, but soon the moor rose into a long, hither tufted curve. As we approached the forbidding and squalid inn, with the sign of a game cock above the door, Holmes gave a sudden groan, and clutched me by the shoulder. He had had one of those violent strains of the ankle which leave a man helpless. With difficulty he limped up to the door, where a squat, dark, elderly man was smoking a black clay pipe.
Who are you, and how do you get my name so pat?
The countryman answered, with a suspicious flash of a pair of cunning eyes.
Well, it's printed on the board above your head. The matter is very important. I would offer you a sovereign for the use of a bicycle.
Where do you want to go?
To Holderness Hall.
Pals of the Duke, I suppose,
said the landlord with ironical eyes.
I've less reason to wish the Duke well than most men, for I was head coachman once, and cruel bad he treated me.
When we were left alone in the stone, flagged kitchen, it was astonishing how rapidly that sprained ankle recovered. Holmes was lost in thought.
Watson, do you remember seeing any cow tracks today?
Yes, several.
Strange, Watson, that we should see tracks all along our line, but never a cow on the whole moor. Can you recall that the tracks were sometimes like that, Watson?
He arranged a number of breadcrumbs in this fashion.
And sometimes like this? Only that it is a remarkable cow which walks, canters, and gallops. By George, Watson, it was no brain of a country publican that thought out such a blind as that.
There were 2 rough-haired, unkempt horses in the tumble-down stable. Holmes raised the hind leg of one of them and laughed aloud.
Old shoes but newly shod, old shoes but new nails. This case deserves to be a classic. Let us go across to the smithy.
Suddenly we heard a step behind us, and there was the landlord, his swarthy features convulsed with passion. He held a short, metal-headed stick in his hand.
You infernal spies! What are you doing there?
Why, Mr. Reuben Hayes,
said Holmes coolly.
One might think that you were afraid of our finding something out.
We did not go very far along the road, for Holmes stopped the instant that the curve hid us from the landlord's view.
I seem to grow colder every step that I take away from it.
Looking in the direction of Holderness Hall, I saw a cyclist coming swiftly along.
Get down, Watson,
cried Holmes with a heavy hand upon my shoulder. I caught a glimpse of a pale, agitated face, a face with horror in every lineament. It was like some strange caricature of the dapper James Wilder. We scrambled from rock to rock, until we could see the front door of the inn. Wilder's bicycle was leaning against the wall beside it. Then, in the gloom, a trap wheeled out into the road and tore off at a furious pace in the direction of Chesterfield.
What do you make of that, Watson?
A red square of light had sprung out of the darkness. In the middle of it was the black figure of the secretary, peering out into the night. It was evident that he was expecting someone.
I must have a peep through that, Watson.
An instant later his feet were on my shoulders. Holmes struck a match and held it to the back wheel.
Come, my friend,
Said he.
our day's work has been quite long enough. I promise that before tomorrow evening we shall have reached the solution of the mystery.
At 11 o'clock next morning my friend and I were walking up the famous Yew Avenue of Holderness Hall. We were ushered into His Grace's study.
The Duke is far from well. He has been very much upset by the tragic news.
I must see the Duke, Mr. Wilder.
But he is in his room.
Then I must go to his room.
The great nobleman appeared. His face was more cadaverous than ever, and he seemed to me to be an altogether older man than he had been the morning before.
I think, Your Grace, that I could speak more freely in Mr. Wilder's absence.
The man turned a shade paler and cast a malignant glance at Holmes.
The reward amounted, if I am correctly informed, to £5,000 to anyone who will tell you where your son is.
Exactly.
And another 1,000 to the man who will name the person or persons who keep him in custody.
Exactly?
I should be glad if you would make me out a check for £6,000. The Capital and Counties Bank, Oxford Street branch are my agents.
This a joke, Mr. Holmes. It is hardly a subject for pleasantry.
I mean that I have earned the reward. I know where your son is, and I know some, at least, of those who are holding him.
Where is he?
He is, or was last night, at the Fighting Cock Inn.
And whom do you accuse?
Sherlock Holmes's answer was an astounding one. He stepped swiftly forward and touched the Duke upon the shoulder.
I accuse you?
Said he. The Duke sprang up and clawed with his hands, like one who is sinking into an abyss. Then he sat down and sank his face in his hands.
I saw his mother's face in his. I could not send him away. But I feared so much lest he should do Arthur a mischief. One James determined to kidnap Lord Saltire. It was of this man Hayes's service that he availed himself. James opened the letter and inserted a note, asking Arthur to meet him in the Ragged Shaw. What brought all his wicked scheme to wreck was your discovery of this man, Heidegger's dead body. James was seized with horror at the news. I yielded to his prayers, and instantly James hurried off to the Fighting Cock to warn Hayes. I agreed with you that complete frankness is the best policy.
Mr. Reuben Hayes was arrested at Chesterfield, on my information, at 11 o'clock last night. I had a telegram from the head of the local police. I will help you, but on one condition only. It is that you ring for the footman, and let me give such orders as I like. You will be glad to hear that your young master is found. It is the Duke's desire that the carriage shall go at once to the Fighting Cock Inn to bring Lord Saltire home. I would suggest that you make such amends as you can to the Duchess. There is one other small point. This fellow Hayes had shod his horses with shoes which counterfeited the tracks of cows.
These shoes were dug up in the moat of Holderness Hall. They are for the use of horses, but they are shaped below with a cloven foot of iron.
Holmes opened the case, and moistening his finger he passed it along the shoe. A thin film of recent mud was left upon his skin.
I am a poor man,
said he, as he patted it affectionately, and thrust it into the depths of his inner pocket.